about the future of the Chinese economy. There are different camps.
We take a very long-term view. It's going to continue to be one of the most important economies in the world.
Chinese economy now is in the process of transforming.
That's something that we and others are watching closely to see what kind of policy actions are taken.
Do you think the recession ahead in the United States is really something off the table?
You know, our economists would tell you there's a 15% risk of recession in 2024. So I just don't think it's on the near-term horizon.
Now the market consensus that the Fed will do 3 cuts this year.
My own view is I think there's a reasonable possibility that we'll see some cuts this year, but I think there's also a possibility that we'll see less than 3 cuts or no cuts at all.
The road about the control of the inflation is bumpy.
I think there's a risk that inflation could be sticky, and the path to 2%, to the 2% target, might not be as straight as the market anticipates at the moment.
欢迎收看《顶级投资人》，本期嘉宾是高盛董事长兼首席执行官 David Solomon， 他有一个中文名字叫苏德威。高盛来自美国，历史超过150年，是世界领先的投资银行、证券和投资管理公司。高盛1984年在香港设立亚太总部，又于1994年分别在北京和上海开设代表处。此后，高盛在中国政府、国内大型企业以及民营企业在国际资本市场的大型交易中担任重要角色。David Solomon 从业近40年，2018年10月开始担任高盛的首席执行官。在 David 今年第一次中国之行中，顶级投资人节目获得了30分钟的独家专访。我们的采访就从他的中国之行开始。David, thank you very much for your time to take this interview. First of all, what's the purpose of this trip?
I'm in China to spend time with our clients, and I'm also in China to spend time with our people. And so, typical as I do with anywhere that our clients are and our people are, I like to come learn from our clients, spend time with our clients, and also spend time with our people.
Let's talk something about China, David. After the pandemic, about the future of the Chinese economy, there are different camps in the world, optimistic, pessimistic, or somewhere in between. So which camp are you in?
I wouldn't define it the way you've just defined it. I think the Chinese economy is a very, very significant economy. It's been sluggish and I think impacted both by the pandemic and also by certain sectors of the economy that have led to slower growth than we had typically seen. But when you take a long-term view, the Chinese economy will continue to grow. I think our research estimate is for between 4 and 5% growth this year. That's still very significant growth for a large economy. And so while it's maybe slower than people had anticipated, and there are certainly some pressures on the Chinese economy, we take a very long-term view. It's going to continue to be one of the most important economies in the world, and it will continue to grow and expand. There are 1.4 billion people here, and that obviously has an impact on economic activity.
Chinese economy now is in the process of transforming from the old engines to the new engines. You may have heard it. After 2 sessions, there were a buzzword catchphrase in China, which is called new quality productive force, which basically means we want China to move higher in the value chain. So do you think, is that the answer to Chinese economic problems?
The Chinese economy is a very, very significant global economy, and it continues to grow and transition. There's been a significant amount over a long period of time foreign direct investment in China, which has also spurred growth. I'm confident that in the long run, the Chinese economy will continue to be very important to economic growth around the world. At the moment, the economy is going through a transition, as you state, and that's something that we and others are watching closely to see what kind of policy actions are taken and how that economic growth evolves over time.
Goldman Sachs have made a lot of inroads in China. How much importance would you give to China?
Well, Goldman Sachs has been in China for about 30 years, and China's important to Goldman Sachs because it's important to our clients. And so global companies that are our clients operate here. There are companies in China that we've done business with for a long time that operate here. So China's important to Goldman Sachs just as any important part of the global economy is because it's important to our clients.
You have a lot of business here in China, investment banking, asset wealth management business here in China. Do you have any priorities among these businesses?
Well, the firm's business is focused on 2 big businesses that the firm operates all over the world. First is what we call global banking and markets, which is our investment banking business and our trading business. in fixed income currencies, commodities, and equities. And then second is our asset and wealth management platform. They're both significant businesses that we operate on a global basis, and they're both very important to the firm.
过去一年，美国经济的韧性以及美国股市的涨势都让人印象深刻。但繁荣的背后是否隐藏着风险？控制通胀的道路是否平坦？美国政府的债务水平是否可持续？以及人工智能到底能够在多大程度上提高生产力？这些话题 ，David 都给出了答案。
David, we live in a very difficult world, very complicated world, and the easy money is over, and the trading war between China and the United States is raging, and even worse, we have two real wars ongoing in Europe and the Middle East. But when we look at the market, everything is going up. The equity market, the gold, even the Bitcoin. So the question is why, and what's the catalysts behind that?
Well, broadly speaking, economic growth in the world has been relatively stable, particularly coming out of the pandemic. I think part of this is a response to the fact that governments around the world were very stimulative with their fiscal policy coming out of the pandemic, and that certainly helped sustain a reasonable economic environment around the world. The U.S. economy has been quite resilient. I think people have been surprised by how resilient the U.S. economy has been given the monetary tightening that's gone on in the last 12 months. And so when you look broadly at economic growth, it's been reasonable despite the fact that we live in a complicated world at the moment.
Yes, you said the U.S. economy is quite resilient. So do you think the recession ahead in the United States is really something off the table?
I think there's always a risk of recession. You know, our economists would tell you there's a 15% risk of recession in 2024. We've had a relatively robust economy that's been supported by good economic growth, but also a significant amount of fiscal stimulus. I don't think it's likely at this point that we'll see a recession in 2024, but recessions are a normal part of economic activity, and at some point we will see a recession in the United States. I just don't think it's on the near-term horizon.
Yeah, you also said that the fiscal spending will help the U.S. economy to grow. So do you worry anything like the sustainability of the U.S. debt?
I certainly worry about the U.S. debt, and I think debt levels have grown enormously in the U.S. over the course of the last 15 years, and I think it's a significant concern. I think you're clearly going to see in the U.S., once we get past the election, more discussion about spending policy, debt levels, and I think this is something the U.S. is going to have to wrestle with. But I am quite concerned about the level of debt in the United States. And obviously, in an environment of higher interest rates, it's more expensive to refinance that debt. And so that's something that I think is going to get a lot of attention in the years ahead.
Now the market consensus that the Fed will do 3 cuts this year from this summer as soon as June. Do you agree with that?
The consensus is for 3 interest rate cuts. Now, that's changed materially since January. In January, the consensus was for 7 interest rate cuts. My own view is I think there's a reasonable possibility that we'll see some cuts this year, but I think there's also a possibility that we'll see less than 3 cuts or no cuts at all. I think the Fed's actions will be very, very dependent on the economic data they see in the months ahead. Clearly, the consensus is for 3 cuts at the moment, but I think it's very important to watch the economic data as it unfolds in the coming months.
Chairman Jay Powell also said that the road about the control of the inflation is bumpy.
What I would say is that I think the variety of things going on in the macro that certainly create inflationary pressures, and while the Fed has done a good job moderating inflation over the course of the last 12 months, I think there's a risk that inflation could be sticky, and the path to 2%, to the 2% target, might not be as straight as the market anticipates at the moment. Well, it's
last mile may be the hardest.
There are some that have said the last distance is the hardest, but it's uncertain. There are a bunch of challenges in the global economy that could have an impact on the overall inflation trajectory, and all I'm suggesting is that the Fed will watch that very carefully, and they'll make the decisions around the policy rate based on the facts as they see them.
The U.S. equity market now is in the all-time high area. The investors are very happy, but also very nervous. Do you think, is it possible that the bull market now is going to turn into a bubble?
I wouldn't say that or suggest that. Equity performance in the United States has been strong. A lot of that performance has been driven by a small number of stocks. There are 7 stocks that get a lot of attention are kind of 30 to 35% of market cap, and they've driven a lot of performance. But broadly speaking, the U.S. economy is quite healthy. I don't see a bubble in U.S. markets at this point, but that doesn't mean that there aren't stocks that have moved, very aggressively over the course of the last, 6 to 12 months that could reverse that trajectory over time. But I don't see any bubble characteristics in the stock market in the U.S. at the moment.
You mentioned the 7 stocks, the artificial intelligence. To be sure, the technology will advance in the future, no doubt. But do you think the market euphoria will cool a little bit this year?
Artificial intelligence is a technology that's been around for a long time. Obviously, there's an acceleration in the pace of that technology and also the access that's available to individuals around the world through that technology. I think the technology is very, very exciting and has the potential to significantly increase productivity in the world. And at the moment, obviously, there's a lot of excitement around that and a lot of investment going into accelerating those technologies. As with any other technology, it will have a life cycle, it will have a span. I'm very excited about the opportunities with artificial intelligence and these large language models. Yes. And I think there's going to be enormous productivity gains as real use cases are deployed with this technology over time.
Over time, you mean higher productivity, but over time. The thing is how much and how soon do you expect?
Well, our research predicts a 1.5% productivity gain compounded over the course of the next 10 years. I think that's starting to come into play, real time now, as people take these new large language models and they start to employ them in businesses and activities. And so I think this will accelerate over time, and I think it's a trend that it allows people to be much more productive.